A view from outside Parliament this morning. I'm Kokeli Tanda. It's an important day at Parliament and indeed an important day for the nation and the country. This afternoon at 2 o'clock, Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan is to present the 2012-2013 budget to Parliament and the nation. But while we wait for the 2 o'clock deadline to come, we look at his options through the eyes of an economist right here with me, and also through the eyes of politicians in a panel discussion later on. Our first guest is Mr. Abdul Waheed Patel. He's the Managing Director of Ethico and expert in governance and governmental and regulatory affairs. Good morning and welcome, Mr. Abdul.
Good morning, Dr. Kelly.
Let's first look at the scope of the national and global economic backdrop and the situation here locally. Just what will the minister have to take into mind when he presents his budget?
I think importantly, the minister will continue to recognize that the global economic backdrop, the sovereign debt crisis in Europe in particular, continues to pose significant global risk to developing and emerging economies and to South Africa in particular. And I think he'll emphasize that whilst, of course, South Africa has been largely cushioned from the kinds of effects we've seen in Europe, I think there will be a prudent approach in the way in which the fiscus and the fiscal stance is outlined in the budget.
In his opening address, the president made an announcement of major infrastructure development. But just where is that money going to come from?
I think this is the great anticipation that the nation will be waiting with bated breath to see what kind of detail the Minister of Finance puts to the President's announcement around the 300 billion infrastructure ramp up. I think what's also important to bear in mind that in the 2011 medium-term budget policy statement, the Minister of Finance did in fact allude to the fact that over the 3-year period going forward, the infrastructure program of government in terms of enhancing enterprise competitiveness and the competitiveness of the economy is going to be a major priority. So I think the infrastructure question is not a surprise. I think the issue is the detail. Where's the money going to come from? What kind of options the minister is going to outline that government would exercise?
Talking about options, can he borrow from other countries? If not, what other options does he have?
I think borrowing will feature. I think the issue is how that borrowing is going to be structured. Clearly, one option is the extent to which the healthy balance sheets of the viable state-owned enterprises who will be responsible for managing this infrastructure and, in fact, operating it will be able to leverage funds on international capital markets. But effectively, government will have to provide guarantees in order for that to happen, just like we've seen with the ESCOM example. So that's one option. The other option is looking at sovereign wealth funds potentially, particularly in countries like the Middle East or regions like the Middle East. And already we've seen government in the last few months taking steps towards strengthening trade and economic relations with the Middle East. So that's one possible indicator. I'm not sure whether the Minister of Finance will outline all the detail of the funding sources, and perhaps what we will get is a broad outline of what the options are as opposed to specific options that will be exercised.
But is it likely to push up tax levels to pay for this infrastructure?
I think the minister will be loath to announce fundamental tax reforms that pose an additional burden on South African taxpayers. I think what we're likely to see is a continued focus on reining in tax non-compliance, around continuing to promote increased compliance amongst taxpayers, which has generally been very good over the last 15 years under the management of Treasury and SARS. So I think there'll be a continuation of that trend. I don't think we're going to see much improvement in the way of new tax relief measures, but I think the big question is, will he make any fundamental announcements around taxation that is going to be used to fund the national health insurance? I think that's the big anxiety that South Africans probably have on their mind, and how it's ultimately going to hit their pocket.
What about taking from the poor, cutting social grants? Is that an option?
I don't think it's an option for government. We have a high unemployment problem in the country, huge levels of inequality and poverty. And I think the State of the Nation address was fundamentally centered around that, the triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. I think politically it will be risky for the ruling party, being the party in government. It is a constituency whose interests they seek to promote. And frankly speaking, it is a strata of our population that do not have access to other recourse. So I think government will be loath to cut social spending. The issue is what additional provisions it makes for increased social spending, given the widening unemployment and inequality gap, and how that's actually going to impact on the management of the fiscus.
We've got many demands for the budget, from education, health, and the military to keep those boats in the water and aircrafts in the air. What should his priorities be?
I think the minister's going to have, like in previous years, a very delicate balancing act that he's going to have to pull off. He's going to have to appease a number of constituencies, the business sector, the investor community, organized labor, and ordinary South Africans. So I think we're likely to see a little bit of everything, but I think the main focus is going to be on government's 5 priority areas, which the current government of the day effectively was their ticket into office at the last national elections, and that's education, health, jobs, agriculture, safety. So I think we're going to continue to see a trend of resource allocation responding to those 5 priority areas. And then the big one, as we said earlier, the detail around the infrastructure program, the 300 billion rand, where that's going to be coming from, how it's going to be funded, what the options are, and if we're going to borrow to fund that, how actually fiscal debt is going to have to be managed.
But what will he need to keep that fine balance of a budget deficit and yet meeting all the service delivery demands?
I think in the medium-term budget policy statement, the Minister of Finance in 2011 already outlined that the goal is to keep the budget deficit within the 5% band of GDP, and by 2015 reducing it to 3%. And I think the Minister will indicate today whether in fact factoring into account the increased infrastructure spend and the options, whether that is going to come from borrowed sources, external markets, what proportion is going to come from taxes that are levied perhaps. He will indicate whether we still are within a range of the 5% target of GDP, or whether we're exceeding it, and what the implications of that are. I think the other issue is striking the balance between meeting basic services, not just of the poor, but of ordinary South Africans across the board. We're talking about water, electricity, delivering sanitation services, maintaining roads and basic infrastructure, and balancing that with the needs of moving towards a modernized, advanced, industrialized economy with the big infrastructure spend in ports, rail, roads, airports, energy. And I think that's the balancing act. How is the minister going to allocate funding to ensure that actually those 2 areas of priority speak to each other, that they're not out of kilter, that we continue to meet basic needs while investing in the future?
In your own view, where do you see the deficit going this year?
Look, I think the Treasury will maintain a prudent fiscal stance, and it will remain within the 5 to 6% band. I think the Treasury will be very cautious about creating a situation where it moves beyond the 5 to 6% band, because it effectively takes it out of the forecast of the MTBPS of bringing it down to 3% by 2015. And I think the Treasury will be, and the Minister and government as a whole will be mindful of the fact that we've got a ballooning state wage bill. So I think they'll be very careful about how they manage the budget deficit, and not to create the kind of commitments which take us out of kilter with the forecast. Added to that, the international credit rating agencies have already in late 2011 downgraded South Africa's rating, and part of that was around the concerns of a budget deficit, ballooning public sector wage bill. So I think those factors will weigh down on the minister when he pronounces and he makes his announcements today.
Mr. Abdul Waheed Patel, thank you very much. We've got to go for a commercial break. We will continue right after that.